last thing the radio transmitted was a human scream, so loud and distorted, cracked the speaker, followed by the sound of crashing waves. From inside the lighthouse, Nathaniel Cross had heard worse sounds during his 23 years in the Navy, but never from a place that should have been dry land. The recording, played back from the Coast Guard station, would haunt the investigation for months afterward. But by then, everyone who had been on Tillamook Rock was either dead or missing. It began 3 weeks earlier, when Nathaniel first set foot on the jagged outcropping that locals called Terrible Tilly. The decommissioned lighthouse had stood, abandoned since 1957, its windows boarded, its light extinguished. But Coastal Weather Dynamics had purchased the structure and retrofitted it with experimental monitoring equipment, sensors that could track storm patterns with unprecedented accuracy. They needed a caretaker, someone comfortable with isolation and rough seas. Nathaniel's military pension wasn't enough, and the job paid well for what seemed like simple maintenance work. The helicopter that dropped him off struggled against the October wind, its rotors whipping the perpetual mist that shrouded the rock. As it disappeared toward the mainland, Nathaniel felt the familiar weight of solitude settle around him like an old coat. The lighthouse rose 90 feet above the churning Pacific, its red brick walls stained black with decades of salt spray. And neglected. Inside, the company had installed a modest living quarters on the second floor, complete with a kitchen, bedroom, and radio equipment. The weather sensors were scattered throughout the structure, their soft electronic humming a constant companion. Nathaniel settled into a routine: morning equipment checks, afternoon maintenance, evening radio reports to the mainland. The work was simple, almost meditative. But on his fourth night, he heard the whispers. They came through the weather sensors at first, faint voices mixed with the electronic static. Nathaniel assumed it was interference from passing ships or radio chatter bleeding through the frequencies. But the voices spoke no language he recognized, and they seemed to grow clearer each night, as if learning how to use the equipment. By the end of his first week, the foghorn began sounding during clear skies. Nathaniel knew the automatic system had been disabled years ago. The horn required manual activation, yet it would blare across the water in the middle of bright afternoons when visibility stretched for miles. Worse, the pattern wasn't random. After listening carefully, Nathaniel realized it was Morse code. THELPME, repeated endlessly until he would climb to the horn's mechanism and force it to stop. Dr. Amira Delgado arrived on a supply boat during Nathaniel's second week, ostensibly to study seal migration patterns from the rock's unique vantage point. A marine biologist from UC Davis, she was compact and intense, with the kind of focus that came from years of fieldwork in harsh conditions. She set up her equipment on the lighthouse's lower gallery, tracking the movements of harbor seals and sea lions. "Beautiful place," she said, setting up her telescopic camera. "Terrible name, though. Who calls a lighthouse Terrible Tilly?" "The keepers who worked here," Nathaniel replied. According to the historical records, this was one of the most dangerous assignments on the coast. Storms would trap crews for months at a time. Amira spent her first night in the lighthouse's makeshift guest room, a converted storage space on the first floor. She woke Nathaniel before dawn, her face pale and drawn. "Did you hear the pacing?" she asked. Someone was walking in circles overhead. All night. Nathaniel frowned. "I was in my room on the second floor. You would have heard me coming and going." "Not on the second floor," Amira said. "Higher. In the lantern room." The lantern room had been sealed off for decades, its narrow spiral staircase blocked by a locked door. Nathaniel had the only key, and it hung on a hook beside his bed. But when they climbed to check, they found the door standing open. Salt water puddled on the floor beyond it. Wet footprints circled the room's perimeter, leading to and from the massive Fresnel lens that had once focused the lighthouse's beam. Elliot Vane arrived 3 days later, uninvited and unwelcome. A part-time historian and full-time obsessive. He had somehow learned about the lighthouse's reactivation and talked his way onto a fishing boat headed for the rock. Thin and nervous, with prematurely gray hair and ink-stained fingers, Elliot carried a waterproof case filled with old documents and photographs. "I've been researching Tillamook Rock for 15 years, he explained, spreading papers across Nathaniel's kitchen table. "There are records here that don't make sense. Crew manifests that don't match departure logs. Supply deliveries to men who were never officially stationed here." Among his documents was a journal, entry dated December 15th, 1881, written in perfect Mandarin Chinese. The entry described terrible visions of drowning men climbing the lighthouse stairs, their faces blue with seawater, their clothes streaming. The problem, Elliot explained, was that none of the lighthouse keepers in 1881 spoke Chinese. Similar entries appeared throughout the historical record, keepers' logs written in Russian, Gaelic, Portuguese, languages the writers shouldn't have known. "It's as if something else was guiding their hands," Elliot said. "Something that wanted to tell its story in every tongue it had learned." That night, all three of them heard the pacing. The sounds came from the lantern room, steady footsteps circling the lens, accompanied by whispers in a dozen different languages. When they climbed to investigate, they found the door locked, the key still hanging in Nathaniel's room. But through the keyhole, they could see movement shadowy figures reflected in the lens's prisms, walking in endless circuit around the sea. Light Deacon Roy arrived with the next supply run, though nobody had requested his services. A silent man in his 60s with calloused hands and distant eyes, he introduced himself simply as someone who maintained old buildings. His boat was a converted fishing vessel filled with restoration tools and religious paraphernalia. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who had found redemption in solitude. "Some places hold their pain," he said, examining the lighthouse's foundation. "This rock has swallowed too many souls to ever let them rest." Roy worked methodically, repairing weathered stonework and reinforcing the structure's aging joints. But his presence seemed to agitate whatever haunted the lighthouse. The whispers grew louder, and the foghorn's Morse code messages became more frantic. Equipment began failing without explanation. Weather sensors registering impossible readings. RADIO equipment broadcasting static-filled voices speaking in dead languages. Roy's third night, Amira captured something extraordinary on her wildlife cameras. Emotion-activated devices, positioned to track seal movements, instead recorded figures emerging from the churning waves around the rock's base. Pale forms that might once have been human climbed the lighthouse's exterior walls with impossible ease, their limbs moving with the fluid grace of deep-sea creatures. The footage was grainy and distorted, but the figures' faces were clearly visible, blue-lipped and hollow-eyed, expressions locked in eternal terror. Elliot's research took on new urgency. He discovered that the original lighthouse crew from 1881 had indeed vanished without trace, but their final journal entries suggested they hadn't left willingly. The head keeper, James McAllister, had written, "The light calls to them, and they answer. We have become their voice, their witness. Soon we will join their endless watch." The entry was dated 3 days after McAllister's official death by drowning. The storm arrived on a Thursday, building from a distant disturbance into a howling tempest that battered the rock with 30-foot waves. The lighthouse's foundation shuddered with each impact, and salt spray coated the windows so thickly that day became indistinguishable from night. The weather sensors registered wind speeds that exceeded their measurement capacity, while the barometric pressure plunged to levels that should have been impossible outside a hurricane's eye. But the storm's fury paled beside what happened to the light itself. As the wind reached its peak, the lighthouse's Restored beacon flickered to life, though nobody had activated it. The massive lens began to rotate, casting its beam across the storm-tossed waters. But instead of the steady white light that had once guided ships to safety, something else pulsed from the lantern room, a strobe that seemed to tear holes in the darkness itself. Sergeant Lowell's rescue helicopter arrived just after midnight, battling through the storm in response to Nathaniel's distress call. But as the aircraft approached the lighthouse, Lowell's voice crackled over the radio with increasing confusion and terror. Coast Guard base. This is Rescue 7. Something's wrong with the light. It's not showing what should be there. Repeat. Rescue 7. What's your visual on the lighthouse? The light's not working, but something else is flashing up there. Jesus Christ, I can see ... I can see myself crashing into the water. I can see my own death. The transmission cut to static, followed by the sound of rotor blades striking water. Lowell's helicopter vanished beneath the waves. Its wreckage never recovered. Inside the lighthouse, the 4 survivors huddled together as the impossible light pulsed overhead. Each flash revealed glimpses of futures that should never come to pass. Amira drowning in her sleep, her lungs filled with seawater despite being 40 feet above the ocean. Elliot writing frantically in languages he didn't understand, his hands moving with someone else's will. Roy kneeling in prayer as pale figures surrounded him, their blue lips whispering absolution for sins that weren't his own. And Nathaniel saw himself at the radio, screaming into the microphone as waves crashed around him, not outside the lighthouse, but within its walls, as if the ocean itself had invaded their sanctuary. The visions were prophecies, and prophecies, they discovered, had a way of fulfilling themselves. The water began seeping through the lighthouse's stone foundation just after 2 a.m., rising with each pulse of the terrible light above. But it wasn't seawater that flooded the lower levels. It was something else, something that whispered in forgotten languages and carried the cold of the deepest trenches. The drowned crew of 1881 had finally found their way home, and they brought the ocean's darkness with them. Nathaniel's final radio transmission lasted 17 seconds. The recording captured his voice, clear and terrified, reporting that the light had stopped working. Then came the sound of crashing waves from inside the lighthouse, followed by a scream so piercing and distorted that it overloaded the radio equipment. The Coast Guard investigation found the lighthouse empty. 3 days later, its weather sensors still functioning, its equipment intact. The only trace of the missing occupants was a series of journal entries written in languages none of them had known: Mandarin, Russian, Gaelic, Portuguese, and a dozen others. The entries all told the same story of drowned souls who had found their voice through the living, of a light that showed not what was, but what must be. Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was sealed again in 2024, its weather monitoring program permanently discontinued. But on clear nights, fishermen report seeing a strange strobe from the direction of Terrible Tilly, not the steady beam of a proper lighthouse, but something that pulses with malevolent intelligence, calling to those who would dare to look upon their own doom. The rock keeps its secrets and its hunger, waiting for the next keeper brave enough to tend a light that doesn't guide ships home, but draws them down into the hungry darkness below. At exactly 3:33 a.m., every intercom on Vulture 9 turned on by itself, and what came through wasn't human. Not anymore. Kyle Bronson's eyes snapped open in his narrow bunk, the welding scars on his hands suddenly burning as if fresh. The sound, cascading through the steel corridors, wasn't quite a voice, wasn't quite static. It was something that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. In the 18 months since his release from Huntsville, Kyle had learned to distinguish between the ghosts in his head and the sounds of the real world. This belonged to neither category. The intercom crackled again, a wet sound like lungs full of seawater trying to speak. Then silence, save for the eternal mechanical heartbeat of Vulture 9200 miles from Louisiana's coast, 12,000 meters above the deepest hole humanity had ever drilled into the Earth's flesh. Kyle swung his legs over the edge of his bunk and reached for his work boots. His cellmate's voice echoed in his memory. Some doors shouldn't be opened, especially the ones underground. Marcus had been talking about prison tunnels, but standing here in the belly of this floating steel cathedral, Kyle wondered if some wisdom transcended context. 3 decks below, Dr. Erin Maddox sat in the improvised office she'd carved out of a storage compartment, reviewing the files that had brought her to this godforsaken platform. Hyperion Energy Corporation had hired her after the 3rd suicide in 6 weeks. Men who had worked oil rigs their entire lives, suddenly walking into drill shafts or over railings into the Gulf's black embrace. The company needed answers that didn't involve liability lawsuits or federal investigations. The psychological profiles made for disturbing reading. Terry Macklin, a 20-year veteran drill operator, had begun scratching geometric patterns into every surface he touched. Blake Surrey, barely 25 and fresh from technical college, had filled 17 notebooks with transcribed conversations he claimed to record in the rig's lower levels. And Father Monroe, whose real name was James, though no one had called him that in years, had been found in the galley at dawn 3 days ago, carving an inverted rig symbol into the wall with a bent spoon, muttering scripture in reverse. Erin's training had prepared her for PTSD, substance abuse, and the psychological toll of isolation. It hadn't prepared her for whatever was happening aboard. Vulture-9. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Terry Macklin stood in the doorway, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion. At 53, he commanded respect through competence rather than authority, the kind of man other roughnecks turned to when equipment failed or storms threatened. Doc. We need to talk, Terry said, his voice carefully controlled. Something's wrong with the drilling data. Has been for weeks now. Erin gestured to the folding chair across from her makeshift desk. Wrong how? Terry pulled out a tablet, his fingers trembling slightly as he navigated through screens of technical data. We're supposed to be drilling through sedimentary rock at this depth. Standard geological formations for this part of the Gulf. But look at these readings. The data showed something impossible: hollow spaces, where solid rock should be, temperature variations that suggested vast caverns beneath the seabed, and pressure. Readings that made no geological sense. It's like we're drilling through a honeycomb, Terry continued. Christ, I don't know what, but every time we push deeper, we hit more empty space. And the acoustic readings. He trailed off, rubbing his temples. What about the acoustic readings? They echo. Everything echoes down there. Drop a tool down the shaft, and you hear it bounce around for minutes. Like there's a whole world beneath us. Erin made notes, fighting to maintain clinical detachment. Have you reported this to Hyperion? Terry's laugh was bitter. You think they'd shut down $1 billion operation because some roughneck got spooked? They want oil, Doc. Black gold to justify this floating monument to human arrogance. After Terry left, Erin found herself walking the rig's corridors, observing. The crew moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had worked together for months, but there was something off in their coordination, subtle patterns in their movements that seemed almost choreographed. She noticed it first in the way they arranged tools, then in how they walked the same routes at the same times, even in their off-hours. Blake Surrey confirmed her suspicions when she found him in the electronics bay, hunched over a jury-rigged recording setup that looked more like amateur radio equipment than professional gear. You're the new shrink, he said without looking up. Come to tell me I'm crazy? Are you? Blake finally turned, and Erin was struck by how young he looked, barely old enough to grow the scraggly beard that covered his jaw. His eyes held the fevered intensity of someone on the edge of a breakthrough. Or a breakdown. "Listen to this," he said, putting on headphones and gesturing for her to do the same. What she heard was static at first, the ambient electrical noise of a massive industrial platform. But Blake adjusted frequencies, filtered background noise, and suddenly she heard its voices in the static, too distorted to understand, but unmistakably human in cadence and emotion. EVP, Blake explained. Electronic voice phenomena. Ghost voices. Some people call them. But these aren't your typical cemetery recordings. These come from below. Deep below. He played another file. This one slowed down and cleaned up. A voice emerged from the noise, speaking in what sounded like backwards English. When Blake reversed the playback, the words became clear. He was buried in fire. "Stop waking him." Erin felt ice form in her stomach. "Where exactly did you record this?" "Maintenance Tunnel 7, right above the main drill housing." "But here's the thing, Doc, the voices are getting clearer. And they're getting angry." That night, Vulture 9 experienced its first total power failure in 3 years of operation. Emergency lighting bathed the platform in hellish red as backup generators struggled to come online. But what disturbed the crew more than the darkness was the sound that came through every speaker, radio, and communication device on the Riga low chant in a frequency that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in their bones. Kyle found himself on the main deck, though he couldn't remember, leaving his quarters. Around him, other crew members stood in similar states of confused awareness, all of them unconsciously arranged in a geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. The chanting continued, a sound like whale songs filtered through human throats, until the backup power finally stabilized and the normal industrial cacophony returned. In the sudden silence that followed, Father Monroe's voice carried across the deck from the radio shack. "He's inside the frequency now. God help us all. He's inside the frequency." Erin found Monroe the next morning, still at his radio station, but changed in ways that made her skin crawl. The man she'd met 3 days ago had been coherent, if eccentric a former merchant marine, who'd found religion after a near drowning and taken to calling himself father, despite having no formal ordination. The man sitting before her now had eyes like broken glass and fingers that wouldn't stop tracing patterns in the air. The tribes knew, Monroe said without preamble. Before Columbus, before Christ, they knew what slept beneath the water. They had ceremonies to keep it sleeping, circles within circles, patterns to contain the hungry dark. He showed her his logbook, pages filled with the same geometric designs she'd seen in Terry's scratches and the crew's unconscious formations. The patterns hurt to follow with her eyes, creating optical illusions that made her feel dizzy and nauseous. "We're making the patterns too," Monroe continued. "All of us. He's teaching us to call him home." The breakthrough came on the 7th day of Erin's assignment. The drill bit, boring through what should have been solid rock, suddenly broke through into empty space, a cavern system that the sonar readings suggested was vast beyond comprehension. The drilling mud that should have circulated back up began flowing into the void, disappearing into depths that seemed to have no bottom. Terry called an emergency halt to operations, but the damage was done. Within hours, something began seeping back up through the drill hole, not oil, but something black and viscous that moved with organic purpose. It pooled on the drill platform, then began spreading in tendrils that defied physics, flowing upward along walls and pipes. Blake was the first to see them clearly, figures emerging from the black substance, wearing the faces of the 3 crew, members who had died in recent weeks. They spoke with familiar voices, knew intimate details about the living crew's lives, and whispered secrets that only the dead should know. Kyle recognized his cellmate Marcus among them, though Marcus had died in a prison fight 2 years ago. The thing wearing Marcus's face smiled with too many teeth and said, "Some doors shouldn't be opened, Kyle. But it's too late now. We've been waiting so long to come home." The crew's attempts to contain the spreading darkness failed as it demonstrated an intelligence that adapted to every countermeasure. It flowed through ventilation systems, emerged from drains, and worst of all, began speaking through the rig's communication systems with voices that belonged to loved ones back on shore, mothers, wives, children calling for help from impossible distances. Dr. Erin Maddox made her final report from the helicopter that evacuated the surviving crew members. Of the 43 people aboard Vulture 9, only 12 made it to the evacuation point. The others had either walked into the sea, thrown themselves into the drilling machinery, or simply vanished into the lower levels of the rig where the black substance had taken complete control. Kyle Bronson's last log entry, recovered from his quarters, read, "We drilled too deep. We didn't find oil. We found the mouth. And it's been hungry for a very long time." The official Hyperion Energy report blamed a catastrophic drilling accident caused by human error and equipment failure. The rig was abandoned, left to drift in the Gulf as a floating tomb. But sometimes, on clear nights when atmospheric conditions are just right, RADIO operators along the Louisiana coast report hearing voices on the emergency frequencies, voices speaking in that bone-deep chant, calling others to come join the crew of Vulture to 9 in the dark waters, where the hungry thing below still whispers its ancient secrets. The geometric patterns still appear in the survivors' notebooks, drawn unconsciously during conversations or meetings. And every night at 3:33 a.m., their phones receive calls from numbers that don't exist, carrying messages in voices they recognize but know are dead. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.